Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of Mindfulness with Puja. Today, we are in conversation with Rabbi David Greenspoon to talk about Judaism. I'm always very keen to learn about other faiths and cultures. To me, it is extremely important to learn about different faiths and what that brings to our world in terms of our friends, neighbors, co-workers, and more. It helps us to get us to know each other better, to know our practices, our beliefs, our culture, our celebrations, and much more. So, with that, welcome to the episode and show, Rabbi David Greenspoon. It's such a pleasure to have you this afternoon. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Puja. Shalom and namaste. Thank you for inviting me.
Namaste. So we are going to talk about some of the key questions that keep coming up with regard to the Judaism and the faith that you believe in and follow. But before we get into that, I would like to know a little bit about your personal journey of being a rabbi and what it basically means to you.
Well, Puja, that is a question that could be answered extremely in detail or with some brevity. I'll try. The quick answer is I grew up in a Jewish day school environment. I had a parochial Jewish education for my primary education through grade 6, and that was extremely formative and really took to the Jewish language and Jewish history and the Jewish celebrations part of my education as a child. And at a certain point, at 18, I was no longer fully a child, and I was enlisted in the United States Navy, and I was in boot camp. And I was realizing there were parts of myself that I really wanted to affirm, and one of those was my Jewish identity. So I started doing that more actively in boot camp, and then during the course of my active duty Navy enlistment. By the time I got off of active duty, my enlistment was concluded. I had an honorable discharge, and I knew two things. One, I was never going back in the Navy. Navy is an acronym for never again volunteer yourself. But if I was going to go back in, it would be as a chaplain. The growth that I had experienced in large measure because of my connection with the chaplains, not just as a Jewish person, but simply as a person, was phenomenal. And it really inspired me. So when I got off of active duty, I gave more consideration to becoming a chaplain, becoming a rabbi in order to become a chaplain. The short story is I finished a bachelor's degree in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and then went straight into the rabbinical program there and was ordained and started serving full-time as a rabbi after that, and including 6 years in the Navy Reserves as a chaplain reservist. That's
extremely impressive. What an array of experience that you bring. It's amazing. Some of the important questions that I have seen that have come forth for us to, have a conversation about are, like, what are some of the key terms for people in your faith or Judaism? If you could enlighten us with those.
Thank you. Puja, it's a different conversation for people who don't come from a predominantly Western background with the Western scriptural traditions, where terms like Israel and Israelite and Hebrew and Hebrews can oftentimes be a little confusing. But even so, there's some nuance in the language that I'm happy to help to clarify. So I am a Jewish person, and as a Jew, I am engaged in the practice of Judaism, which is the faith of the Jewish people and the evolving religious civilization and culture of the Jewish people. So I hope that by using the terms in that sentence, I give you a little bit of an understanding how they might work without trying to give actual definitions. The definition of Judaism that I did work in there is one that we can discuss later as far as its origin, but there is an idea that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And that's very interesting when you think about the 2,000 years of dislocation and lack of statehood and everything that was a major part, diaspora, if you will, that was a major part of the Jewish experience, to be able to have an identity that isn't necessarily geographically bounded, but is rather transnationally cultural is really an important survival element, if you will. Other key terms that I think are important, the word Hebrew refers to the language, the Hebrew language. In other settings, you might hear it used in different ways and it reflects different usages, but truly the word Hebrew refers to the language. The word Israel, technically in this day and age, is most appropriate a reference to the geopolitical state of Israel that occupies certain boundaries, has a political government, and is represented in the family of nations. The word Israeli is a person who is a citizen of Israel. And there are plenty of Israelis who are not Jewish. The vast majority of Jews are not Israeli. So Israeli is a nationality, not a religious or cultural identity. Well, there is an Israeli culture, but it's not a Jewish culture necessarily. So it gets a little blurry in some places. I know plenty of people who are Israeli Arabs who are Christian or Druze or Baha'i, they're absolutely Israeli and they're absolutely not Jewish. I know plenty of Jews who have no connection to Israel as far as they know whatsoever. So those would be some of the big terms that I would put out there.
Yeah, it's so important for us to know these terms, for us to know, what the Jewish identity is all about. So thank you for sharing those. What is a summary statement of Jewish theology for you?
I'm going to suggest that the most emblematic statement of Jewish theology that is prompted out would be the statement from the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, starting with verse 4 through verse 9. And the statement says, hear, in other words, listen, it's a command, hear it, Israel. Adonai is our God and only Adonai, Adonai alone. Our God is one, or however the translations might work, it's translation. And then the next set of the passage really talks about the obligation to be in a covenantal relationship with God. There are all sorts of other key aspects of Jewish theology, but the covenantal identity that as a people, Judaism maintains that we share with God is probably the foundational one. And everything else in one way, shape, or form comes out of that concept of covenant. And we could have long discussions about which parts of covenant and how and when, but I think that the big part that really is most salient for our conversation is the idea that throughout history, when Jewish people have breathed their last breaths, whether it's been in their natural dying or if they've been forced to die in martyrdom, there's been a historical, traditional tradition of reciting that passage. It's part of the final confession that people do on their deathbed or have done for them on their deathbed. And just to think that coming from a time and coming from a place in the world where it was common to appreciate that every rock, every tree, every stream potentially housed a God, to say that God transcended that and that God was in a covenantal relationship as a force in the cosmos, the creative force in the cosmos, with us insignificant creatures of God's own work. Wow, that's huge. And with that come other elements like the importance of human dignity and everything that comes with that, the sanctity of human life, the importance of being able to make authentic choices, knowing that we could equally be good or bad because as humans we're hardwired to go either way. I mean, so I think those were all derivative of the idea that there's a creative God who has a covenantal relationship with humanity, and we understand it this way. So I would say that's probably the big starter, and then all sorts of other things come from there.
Thank you. Yeah, it is important for us to know all of this and more. So could you shed some light on some of the religious practices that are very much ingrained in your culture, in your faith?
So one of the things to appreciate about religious practices in Judaism is that one can be thoroughly Jewish and not necessarily religious or have any type of Jewish religious or spiritual practice. For many, many years, much of the more contemplative elements of Jewish thoughts and practice had been unknown to the vast majority of the Jewish world. And starting in the 50s and 60s, as more and more Jewish people were looking at the absurdity of nuclear annihilation and not finding answers to their big questions in Judaism so quickly, they started turning to Eastern religion. So the idea of Bujus and Hindus and everything else is sort of common in the Jewish world to some degree these days. Right? So I sort of want to point out that there are very few theological red lines that exist in Judaism as far as creedal requirements. One can be an absolute atheist and still be a member of the Jewish people in good standing. So something to keep in mind. Mind you, one starts to go into Krishna consciousness, either the sort of American cult version of Krishna or the authentic Indian version of Krishna, and then you start crossing some of those boundaries. Right? Similarly, the big red line for many Jews in our historical experience has, of course, been Jesus, right? And the idea that Jews who become Christian have very much maintained their cultural and ethnic and familial connections, but theologically, they have left the boundaries of Jewish identity. And yet, if the National Institutes of Health were doing a gene collection, they don't care about theology. They'd look and say, the Jewish genes, as far as we're concerned, and we want to run our study. Right? So again, who's asking and what? The idea of identity and status is always so interesting. So that's the first thing that I would say, right? Jewish identity is a complex conversation. Then there are traditional religious rubrics that suggest that according to traditional Judaism, one is Jewish by dint of being born to a Jewish mother or otherwise having the appropriate conversion into Judaism under the appropriate auspices. Only in the later maybe in the mid-1980s, did one of the more liberal denominations say, if biology by 50% is determinative, we no longer care which 50% it comes, from which it comes. And a Jewish father raising Jewish children in their home exclusively as Jewish, we don't care what the mother's identity or status is. As far as we're concerned, they're Jewish people. So and that's not necessarily accepted in the more traditional elements of the Jewish religious world. And yet, somebody can be completely non-practicing, non-connected, not culturally connected, et cetera, and be in good standing within the Jewish context. And in some corners, somebody who goes to a synagogue regularly and is deeply involved in their Jewish lives, et cetera, might not be. So again, the idea of who's asking what questions and the conflict between status and identity is sort of helpful here. The other thing to keep in mind is that before modernity, Jewish identity was really, by and large, a cultural expression as well of the host culture in which that Jewish community lived. So the Jews who lived in Limoges, France, had much more in common in the daily living, obviously, of the Christians in Limoges, France, than the Jews who lived in Baghdad did with the Jews in Limoges, France. But mind you, the Jews in Baghdad had a whole lot more in common with the Muslims in Baghdad than, right? So you sort of see how that works. So in a lot of ways, when you look at things like Jewish foods as cultural expressions, they're riffs, there are variations, typically because of kosher practices on the local recipes from whence that community comes. So I just hinted towards one of the religious practices that is traditional, and that's the idea of sacred eating. Right? Judaism understands that by making sacred choices in our eating, we elevate the act of feeding our human, animal, bodies into an act that involves intellect and intentionality, spirituality, if you will. And therefore, it elevates both the act and us in that moment into something more. And then, indeed, the Jewish biblical ideal for sacred eating is pretty much a macrobiotic diet, not even dairy, right? It's herbs and grasses and seeds and fruits and vegetables. That's it. And it puts the human creature in harmony with the created earth, and it's sustainable, right? So there's something, and I know that Judaism is not the only Eastern tradition that holds a vegetarian ideal, right? So that's one practice. Another practice is daily prayer. In Judaism, the liturgical day starts the evening before. And the first set of prayers that one says during the course of the liturgical day are the evening prayers. Then the following morning, there is the morning prayers. Both of those prayer services are pretty much patterned after the same basic pattern with some differences in the content. And then the final daily prayer is the afternoon prayer, which is a much shorter prayer. On Shabbat and other holy days, those prayer times are expanded with additions like the reading from the Torah, extra psalms and hymns as appropriate for the nature of the day. If it's a fast day, similarly, extra dirges are added to the liturgy. So the basic building blocks, the schema is there, and it sort of expands with different elements depending on the nature of the holy day. So daily prayer, the way one eats, and then the idea of Shabbat, the 7-day rest cycle. It's my understanding from the scholarship that there were occasional such rest days in the ancient Babylonian world, but it was the brilliance of the Hebrew Bible to make it a mandatory, absolute type of structure. Nature gave us the idea of the seasons and the moons. Some say that the Hebrew Bible gave us the week. Yeah. And the idea that we can not only rest and recharge and need to rest and recharge because of our limited physical human selves, but in doing so, one, we are sort of imitating the godlike power of the cosmos, which we affirm did similarly. So if God needs to rest or chose to rest, certainly we could take that lead and emulate it. But there's also something else. If you were to take a look at any great literature and were to remove the punctuation out of the story, something would get lost. Yeah. You would lose what are the questions and what are the exclamations. You wouldn't know when someone is quoting someone. And Shabbat is like the punctuation point for the week. It lets us say, this is the stop. The word punctuation comes from the German word Punkt, meaning point or stop, right? Punkt, full stop. So by sitting back and having that full stop, we can look backwards and assess, rest, recharge, consider how we might make the next week an even better, more meaningful week in our lives, in our world. Lots of great things happen. But if we don't stop and go into that movement away from busyness with an emphasis just on beingness, then we never get that perspective. Yeah. So the idea of moving away from doing and being busy to just simply being is really the brilliance and the beauty of Shabbat for me. So there are lots of different ways that happens. Above and beyond that, of course, there is a larger liturgical calendar. Above and beyond that, there are Jewish codes of practice and wisdom that inform, if not regulate, depending on your approach, every aspect of one's daily life, one's clothing choices need to meet certain criteria, not only in how much of the body they cover for modesty, but what are the content of the material, the rules that govern intersexual contact and intimacy. There are rules that govern even how one approaches one's philanthropy. One, ostensibly, even on the community dole, is still supposed to contribute back into community needs, right? So there's no avenue of life in the traditional understanding of Judaism that is not impacted by instruction on how to live that life in a holy way. Post-modernity, once the Enlightenment hit, those traditional communities, as they encountered modernity, had to change. And some communities never encountered the Enlightenment. So the Jewish community of Yemen, for instance, didn't encounter modernity until these big aluminum birds landed in their backyards in the 1950s, and they had no idea, right? And these Arab Yemenite Jewish people were coming forward with their households, and here were the men with their 4 wives, just because that's what you do in an Arab country that's pre-modern. But where modernity hit, Judaism's interaction with it was really pretty much a reactive approach, where modernity was pretty much nonplussed to accept Jews into the body politic, for instance, like in France. No long protracted struggle, and you basically had traditional Judaism. You could practice it or not. In Central Europe and Germany, the political debate was long, protracted, vigorous, and oftentimes vicious. And the longer that debate went on, the more and more there were voices within the Jewish community of the German land saying, we would be able to benefit from the political opportunities of citizenship via the emancipation if we could but have a reformation of Judaism in these German lands that was palatable to our German neighbors, and no reformation of Christianity starts there as well. So the idea was to take Judaism and to Germanize it in a way so that the German who was curious as to what happened inside the synagogue could look at it and say, oh, it's just like my Lutheran neighbor, or a Catholic, or Lutheran could say, oh, it's just like my Catholic neighbor. But instead of Latin, they're doing Hebrew, and the sermon, is in German, and there's an organ and there's decorum, and I get this. They're Germans of Mosaic descent. They even changed the word Jewish out. And the more and more the struggle went on, the more and more radical those reformers became. And truly the first modern denomination of Judaism was the Reform movement. People oftentimes mispronounce it and they add an ED to the end, Reformed, and that's not truly accurate. It's the Reform movement of Judaism. There was an immediate reaction by some of the super strong traditionalists in the same communities, and where some went to reform, others went to say there is a right way, and the term for the right way became orthodox. So orthodoxy in Judaism replaced traditional Judaism, sort of lost a lot of its organic flexibility, and really went on point in a polemic way against reform, and became even more and more traditional than traditional Judaism had been prior, as a reaction against reform. They saw it as heretical at best. Once reform got to this country in the United States in the later 1880s, there was an opportunity for a banquet celebrating graduates of seminary, the first seminary in the country, and it was a Reform seminary, and the banquet was complete with foods on the forbidden list from the biblical kosher laws. The reformers were saying, those types of ritual laws, we don't need them. We only need the morally edifying laws. And there were some who said, if this is what reform is, I think I might want to conserve a little bit more than I want to reform. And the beginning of conservative Judaism started in this country, right? So people hear the denominations, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, and have a hard time understanding that the descriptive names are late 18th, late 19th, early 20th century descriptors, and the terms really don't carry over in the common usage and meaning of those terms today. So conservative Judaism is theologically much, much more liberal than most would appreciate. It bases itself in a traditional practice, much like Orthodoxy, but in a very contemporary type of way. But it is both traditional and liberal in certain ways. The other big denominations that grew up in this country that started was the Reconstructionist movement, whose founder was a conservative rabbi who was ordained originally by Yeshiva University as an Orthodox rabbi. And he was enamored of an early 20th century Protestant theological movement called process theology. And Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, became the proponent of a whole new approach of Judaism. He said if there was a biblical age and a rabbinic age and a classical age or a Talmudic age, we now live in a democratic age in Judaism, and we need to keep in mind that tradition has a vote, but not a veto. And he really started a movement that was phenomenally important within the denomination of conservative Judaism, and eventually became its own denomination called Reconstructionist, and then Reconstructing Judaism. So beyond that, there are even newer denominations. The Jewish Renewal Movement is sort of like the counterculture grows up and wants to become a rabbi. There is humanistic Judaism that really has a cultural approach and theologizes the gatherings and celebrations as much as it can. And then on the other side, there's an entire spectrum of orthodoxy that ranges from something that's relatively modern, where there are now women who are being ordained as Orthodox religious leaders. I call them rabbis, but others have a hard time with that, to dynastic groups that were folk revivalist groups from 18th century Europe, the Hasidic groups, and they by and large completely reject modernity. And when they come in from their enclaves out of the suburbs of New York City or other places where they live, they come in on buses that are segregated by gender with a curtain down the middle of it. And the women are dropped off at one place and the men are dropped off at another place. And there's no interaction between them. So, and that's America too. Right, the Jewish community in America. So there's this huge, wide range of Jewish religious observances. And again, if you were to ask somebody, name some of the most important Jews of modern history, many of the names that they would come up with would not be names for whom you could identify the synagogues in which they prayed regularly. Right. So while we think of Judaism as a religion or as a faith, I'm going to guess that most Jews see it probably more along the lines of a religious culture more than anything else. So I would say that's probably more than enough of an answer to your question, Puja. I hope I didn't scare you with it.
No, actually, this is very interesting because there's so much information and so much to learn and know about your culture that it just is very, very exciting for me because, if it was not for you being here, I would not have had the opportunity to learn so much. So thank you for doing what you're doing here.
Well, it's my privilege. Puja, in many ways, the idea is that many American Jews live in two cultures, an American culture and a Jewish culture. And the degree that they live in a Jewish culture or not is much more a voluntary type of approach. They obviously have to be in the American culture. There are some Jews in the American culture so much that you would never know that they were Jewish. And then there are some Jews who are the Jewish culture so much you would never know that they were in America. And I guess that's probably the best way to sum it up.
This is so beautifully put together. And, a lot of this is true for Hindu faith and other faiths also. People are, all over the spectrum with those. But thank you for, telling us about those. You did talk about food, and I think food is integral to any faith, right? Any faith whatsoever. So on that, I have a question for you. What is your favorite food? What do you really like? And what do you guys eat in your household every day? Like what's your daily intake like?
At this point, my favorite Jewish foods tend to be Middle Eastern based as opposed to European based. Let me sort of start with that. And I say that in large measure because I've grown allergic to fish over the course of my lifetime. So all of the Jewish foods that are fish based, like white fish and everything else, are off my diet. And having spent my childhood in North Florida, I grew up fond of fish. So I have to tell you that that's it. These days, I find myself just more and more attracted in general to a Mediterranean diet. Yeah. Just my body likes it more, feels better for it, especially as I minimize red meat more and more. It feels better and better. So I would say that in general, my body and my taste buds are sort of geared towards a Mediterranean palate right now. I had the joy in one of my later visits to Israel before the pandemic. I was walking with some friends after Shabbat services and asking, all right, what are the new places in town that I want to go check out? And I was given the recommendation for, I want to say, a Kurdish Jewish restaurant. It was either Kurdish or Uzbeki. I can't remember. It might have been Uzbeki. Now that I'm thinking about it, it was probably Uzbekistan. I could be wrong. But just the idea of, I can go to Israel and it's not just falafel or shawarma. And trust me, I love my shawarma. But I can also get exposed to, the Asian mountain Jews and their foods and have new favorites come from that. I mean, that's great. So these days, my palate is taking a journey towards my spiritual home. It's more Middle Eastern, more and more. Trust me, I like a good bagel, but I will tell you, my wife makes challah for every Friday night, which is the twisted egg bread, and she is known to try different toppings on it. So oftentimes it'll just be plain, or it might have poppy seed or sesame seed or everything but the bagel spices or whatever. But one of the things that we've really become fond of is taking an Israeli or Middle Eastern spice blend called za'atar, which is hyssop and some other stuff, and putting that in there, and that's just delicious as well. So challah every Friday night is always one of my favorite Jewish foods. Awesome. And in general, the Mediterranean type of diet.
Awesome. One of these Friday nights, I'm going to be coming over to enjoy your favorite meal.
Oh, Puja, would be our pleasure. How many in your household? You, your husband, 2 kids?
Yes. Yeah. 3, 5 of us.
5 of you. All right, we'll figure it out.
Yes. All right. So going forward, I wanted to have an open discussion about the commonalities which occur between Judaism and other faiths. What's your take on that?
So I would say that some other faiths do have strong commonalities, and there are different faiths that don't. And there are some aspects of Judaism that are ancient that resonate more with Eastern thought and traditions, and some aspects of Judaism that are relatively much more modern and developed in other parts of the world that resonate with different things. So I can look at different aspects of Jewish mysticism from different times and say, well, here's where I can see the intersection with Sufism, or I could look at it and say, and here's where I could see the intersection with North German Catholicism from the 10th century, 11th century, or here's where I could see the intersection with what's going on with the mystics of Avignon, and so that happens, right? Sort of like music, mystics tend to have this common language that goes across the boundaries rather easily, right? So in the mystical traditions, there's always going to be intersections with different groups of parochially grounded interest who still share, I think, a common master lexicon, if you'll excuse the gender term, but a common, larger vocabulary. I think that there are intersections of Judaism and Eastern religious values, like in Buddhism and others, about the value of face that get expressed in Judaism about the value of human dignity. The Talmudic rabbis lived in 6th, 7th century, and by the time the Babylonian Talmud was finished in 650, it was canonical as a work, and one of the systemic statements was, whoever causes anyone public embarrassment, it is as though they have murdered them. And that's an operative value for policy. Right? So, the idea of much of Judaism, to my appreciation, is very much intersectional with a lot of its Eastern counterparts. And then there are other parts that are very much Western. I think Judaism's focus on reverence for the ancestors would find deep affinity in Japanese and Korean culture, right? I know that Judaism's cultural emphasis on family resonates deeply in Central Asian, Persian, and Hindu communities, right? I know that Judaism's insistence on monotheism is deeply respected by Islam. So, I mean, there's all sorts of these intersections depending on how you want to recognize them, if you can tune in to recognize them. I think what Judaism does, on one hand, is provide a framework for one to live individually as a righteous person. And I think all religious pathways do that.
Yeah.
I think that what Judaism does as a cultural expression is provide the framework and the cohesion for group identity within which the individual finds their own pathway and expression. And in as much as it might have originally been purely in its most ancient forms, tribal and ethnic, for the last 2,000 years, it's been much more universal. And there's been ways for folks to come in, as well as there have been ways for folks to leave. I think that in the current marketplace of ideas, Judaism is almost contraindicated, and that makes it attractive. We live in a day and age where the radical self just rules, right? And social commentators and philosophers have been writing about the radical I for 20 years now. Books like Bowling Alone and Habits of the Heart have been out since the mid-1980s and early 90s, sort of tracking that trend of how everybody just wants to be themselves and do them. That's great as far as it goes. Judaism also says, as great as far as that goes, there's also something larger than the self. That's sort of counterintuitive these days. And Judaism, in one of its earliest revolutionary statements, made it absolutely clear that personal accountability carries the day. Right? Before Hammurabi, anybody could be punished for anything. Right? Even after Hammurabi, if you had caste and status, you could have one of your slaves stand in for your kid if you didn't want your kid to have his hand chopped off for stealing.
Wow.
Judaism, nope. So Judaism has always insisted on a few things that I think has upset the larger world and maybe caused some of the anti-Semitic reality that does exist. One is personal actions matter. Personal choices matter. The Bible tells us that human beings are hardwired both for good and for evil from the day we are born and created as a species. We've got the ability to choose. And if we don't choose wisely and choose for good, then ultimately we have to be accountable. People don't like that. So accountability, personal accountability, I think has always been a real fundamental benchmark, a hallmark of the Jewish insistence of how the world needs to work. And it's caused some pushback, if not offense. I think another thing that Judaism has insisted on is the dignity of every human being. Even those that in other societies might have been left out for the elements to exterminate. Judaism has never done that. Never seen the value in it. And only recently, in contemporary bioethics, because of the capacity that we have, has Judaism countenanced the idea of terminating pregnancies when you know that the fetus is going to carry a terminal disease. Right? Judaism has always affirmed the value of abortion when it saves the life of a mother. And there have been more, I would say, enhanced understandings of what that means over the course of time. But even going back 2,000 plus years, Judaism has always understood that there's a distinction between a fetus that has not yet been born and the mother that's carrying it. So that as much as there's an insistence on the sanctity of life, Judaism is also pretty much real world as well. I think other things that differentiate Judaism ultimately is the insistence that the world can be better. No matter how good it might seem, the world can be better. We as people can be better. And people are complacent. And especially if they're feeling comfortable in their material success, or if they're feeling comfortable in their emotional space, or if they're just feeling comfortable in being non-disturbed. I think that Judaism really has, over the course of the centuries, proved the value of the statement that religion is supposed to upset the comfortable and comfort the upset. And again, there are times when people, organizations, institutions, other religions, countries don't necessarily want to be reminded that there's a better way at hand. So I think that that's been a factor in the larger Jewish experience. Judaism and Jews have always insisted there's a better way possible. And we need to find it.
That is actually one of the most fundamental ways of leading a good life, to always aspire for a better purpose, better life, right? That there can always be something better that we can add to this world, and the world could be a better place. So I think that's an amazing philosophy to believe in and to live by. Makes a huge difference.
There's a fabulous statement in the Psalms. Miha Isha Chafetz Chaim, who's the person that desires life, meaning like not just a life, but a life that's called, that's worth it. So the advice is guard your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from speaking guile, lies, whatever. To basically to seek after doing good. And the idea, notice that it's not happiness, but goodness. Happiness is ephemeral. If the Genesis G70 makes me happy now, then the GV70 is going to make me happy next year, right?
Yeah.
Then what's going to make me happy after that? A BMW? I don't know. But goodness is constant. If I do the things that make me good, if I do good things, those things are always good. And the reality is, I'm probably more likely to be in a place of happiness because of the goodness that I generate and in which I live than I would if I were to pursue happiness as its own final pursuit. So I think the focus on doing good, right, is really a quintessential Jewish focus. It's not enough to think it, intentionality counts. It's not unimportant at the end of the day. It's not the talking or the rhetoric that matters, but it's the actual doing that counts.
And it's absolutely important to live a more mindful, a more aware life. And I'm so glad that, this is like the foundation of the faith that you believe in. I think it's huge, and it does add a lot of color to the fabric of, what the culture and what the traditions are in Judaism. So thank you for sharing all of this. Thank you for being with me here today and sharing a wealth of information about Judaism and your way of life, your faith with me and the viewers. Do you have any parting words for us?
Puja, there's always so many new questions and so many areas we didn't get into. Whenever you're ready to have me back, it would be my privilege to further the conversation.
Absolutely. I think we must do part 2, part 3 of this conversation, because like you said, there's a lot to learn and there's a lot that we can share with the world and educate people who do not know what the religion and faith is about. And, unity in diversity is what I firmly believe in very strongly. That to me, that is one of the best ways to know who others are and what they believe in, what faith they follow. It tells us a lot about their lives. So until next time, I would love for everybody to be happy, stay blessed, enjoy your life with your loved ones, and lead the best life you possibly can. Take care, stay well. Thank you, Rabbi David Greenspoon, once again for being with us this afternoon. We will see you here back again in the studio again.
Thank you, Puja. It's my pleasure.
Thanks.